Well, it is Monday, April 10th, 2017, and you're listening to 3000 NFL Mock Draft, and we are talking 2017 NFL Draft, and specifically circling around topics that involve the Seahawks, as we usually are wont to do. And right now, we weren't here last week, so we've got 2 weeks worth of topics to cover, and maybe some different news. The Richard Sherman trade talks are still out there, and the team and Sherman both being open about the fact that they do exist. It's not a rumor that the Seahawks are shopping Richard Sherman. It's a fact, but whether or not it actually happens remains to be seen. And Marshawn Lynch potentially wanting to return and come back to the NFL, but not for the Seahawks, perhaps for the Raiders, perhaps some rumors saying this day that it was the Patriots, or that the Patriots could come into play if the Raiders don't work out. So it may not be a one-team only situation for Marshawn. He may just want to return to the NFL after taking a year off. But there's a lot of stuff going around the Seahawks type stuff, and we haven't even, gotten into the draft yet, where, the rumored players that could be falling down or coming up to their pick at 26. Maybe the Seahawks, if you look at some of the visits they've had, or, the way that they treat this draft, it seems like right now is that it seems like they're more keen maybe on guys that would be in the second round than guys in the first round, potentially hinting at another move back for them once again. But we can get into all of that. Might as well just start up top with the stuff that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet, which is the Richard Sherman trade rumors. As far as where he could go or what he could get in return, that's something that can be debated. But, Rob, do you think that with the fact that Richard Sherman might want out of Seattle, and that Pete Carroll may feel that his relationship with Sherman is not in a good place, where he doesn't feel like he can, after last year's blow-ups on the sideline with both coordinators and with Pete Carroll sort of saying, in the media that, yeah, we've cleared everything up with Richard, and then Richard in his next meeting say, I don't know, no, I don't agree with that. We can have a kumbaya meeting and all that kind of stuff, but that's not it seems a little bit like Sherman maybe is defying authority a little bit, and maybe that's a fox in the hen house, you could say, for Richard Sherman and Pete Carroll, if that's the way that they might view it. Though Schneider and Carroll both saying that they don't expect Sherman to be traded, but they are looking into it. So do you think that right now could be the time to trade Sherman, who is approaching 30 and maybe could still fetch a first-round pick plus?
Well, it's certainly possible. I mean, there's really only the one thing that I think is pretty certain that isn't going to happen is that this is just going to muddle on, and by the end of the draft, Sherman's going to still be a Seahawk, and no one's going to have said anything, and they're just going to crack on. I mean, I just think that is incredibly unlikely. I think that one of two things are more likely than that, which is either he's traded at some point between now and the draft, and the other scenario is that they kind of have a renewing of vows, if you want to call it that, where Sherman and Carroll and Schneider come together, they sort of talk through their differences, and then there's maybe a press conference where they say, look, we've sorted this out, everybody's on the same page, and we're going to move forward and try and win a Super Bowl. Because I think part of the problem is that it's clear that there was an issue with Sherman at times last year, as Pete Carroll referenced it. It was kind of self-inflicted. He, for whatever reason, has decided to go down that path, and we're still talking about the lost Super Bowl, which was concerning, and he kind of gave this impression that the whole team was kind of consumed by it, and then Pete Carroll's getting asked about it, and really it's time for this team to move on. They may well have legitimate gripes about what happened at the end of that game, but they've got to move forward now. They cannot let that one game dictate what is going to happen to them in the future. And it seems like Sherman has had a real difficulty moving on from that. And if that's the case, and if he's going to be a further distraction, and if he's going to create the kind of drama that we saw at the end of last season, then Pete Carroll's got very little choice but to move him. Adam Schefter is insisting, he's been tweeting again today, it's suggesting that it's Sherman who has asked for a trade, which is bizarre and kind of hints that really something is not right here. And I think all of the momentum is towards a potential deal happening. It's just, how badly do the Seahawks feel like they have to move Richard Sherman? Because if this is a situation that is untenable, that they cannot work together, that the relationship is so broken that they have to move in, then he's going to go. I kind of get the sense that if they don't feel that this is a situation that can't be repaired, then there's virtually no chance he's going to get moved anyway, because why would you move a player as good as Richard Sherman if there was a chance to sort of repair that relationship and move forward together? So I think we'll find out in the next sort of 10 days. I know there's been suggestions that there could be a trade during the draft. The reason why that won't happen is because teams never trade for veteran players of Sherman's age that earn, $10-11 million a year without doing a physical and a medical first. So, this idea that someone would come up to be on the clock and then say, hey, let's trade for Richard Sherman, and then it happens, that, there's a reason why we never see big name veterans really traded on draft day, because you need to have all the medical information. So I think if this is going to happen, it's probably going to be between now and the draft. And I still think the most likely outcome is if the New England Patriots trade Malcolm Butler to New Orleans, get the number 32 overall pick, and maybe that is something that they would use then to try and get Richard Sherman. I don't see much interest from other teams emerging between now and the draft. So that's maybe the one to keep an eye on, and it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks.
Yeah, it sounds like it could happen for sure, and that there are parties that want it to happen. And if it's going to be Richard Sherman going to a situation like the one in New England, how fascinating it would be for the Patriots. They have to first they traded for Brandon Cooks and gave up the 32nd overall pick and didn't do Malcolm Butler, and then would they trade Malcolm Butler to the Saints after all and get the 32 pick back and then use that to get Richard Sherman, so that with that 32nd overall pick and Malcolm Butler, they come back and they have Brandon Cooks and Richard Sherman. Would be quite the trade-off there for New England. Certainly would put Sherman in his situation that he wants to be in, which is in as a Super Bowl contender. And Marshawn Lynch, another guy that's been involved in trade rumors. But there's a lot of complications with Marshawn Lynch's deal. While Sherman's deal is actually quite nice for a player of his caliber at $11 million a season for whoever takes him on. Marshawn Lynch, if the Seahawks trade him, he comes with a $9 million cap hit. The Raiders, of course, being the number one team that being talked about as being involved, and they do have a needed running back. So it seems like the biggest thing holding the back would either be Jack Del Rio. It seemed like he was the last sign off, and so far I don't know if anyone has said that he has signed off. And the fact that if the Seahawks release him, will Marshawn Lynch be willing to just give them back $2.5 million? Then he has to go to Oakland and hope that they give enough money to cover what he's paid back, plus reasonable pay, plus all that other types of stuff that goes in. Do you see anything feasibly happening with Marshawn Lynch? Because that's another situation where it seems like everyone's been sort of open about the fact that he does want to come back and does want to play for a team besides the Seahawks, but there are complications in the way. How do you sort of weigh or see that situation going out?
Oh, I just think Marshawn Lynch will either stay retired or he will end up in Oakland. I think the fact that it seems to be dragging on as long as it has perhaps suggests that he isn't going to be unretiring. And I think probably the reason for that is that Oakland will not want to pay him $9 million a year. The Seahawks are probably not going to be willing to just release him. And I think that the communication levels between the three parties, Oakland, Seattle, and Lynch, will have been good enough that they will kind of be abreast of the situation in all counts. And if Oakland know that the Seahawks won't release him, I don't think Lynch is going to pull any, power play here against the Seahawks and then unretire and then be forced them to release him. I just don't see that kind of drama happening. He might have been a pain in the arse for the Seahawks at times and for Pete Carroll in the past. But I also suspect he has a lot of respect for the Seahawks and would not want to do that. And I think what the Seahawks plan to do is to probably trade him for something, minor, probably a 6th, 7th round pick or a conditional pick of some kind, to make sure they actually get something for the fact that they, paid Marshawn Lynch a considerable signing bonus to go off and retire. So they'll want to get something in return, and that would mean that Oakland would then acquire his $9 million salary. And then it's a case of, Lynch, are you willing to reduce this salary to come and play for us? And maybe the Oakland Raiders are saying, look, the market is $4.5 million or $4 million or something for a veteran, productive Pro Bowl or pro type running back. That's what we want to give you. And maybe Marshawn Lynch is saying, I need $7 or $8 million to make this worth my while. I don't know. That would be my best guess of the situation. And the likelihood of this happening is probably whether or not either Lynch lowers his demands or Oakland raises what they're willing to pay him. I think that probably there's going to be a bit of pressure on Oakland to pay him because they're on a big PR thing now because they're going to Las Vegas. They need to get fans through the door in Oakland, and the prodigal son playing for them for a year or two is probably the best way to do that. So there's probably a lot of pressure on them. I think this whole New England story today about Lynch is probably a power play from Lynch to try and get the Raiders to pony up, because always throw the Patriots name in there if you need to get some leverage. So I think that's what's happened. I think that this week is probably going to be when we know whether this is going to happen or not. I can't imagine this dragging on into the draft. It's either going to happen soon or it's not going to happen at all, and it probably could go either way.
Moving on to the draft, there are a lot of things surrounding the cornerbacks and the safety situation for the Seahawks. Is they need to revamp their secondary, especially if they were to trade Richard Sherman. They would hope to get back a pick and a player, and that player being someone that they know is capable of playing at a high level in the NFL, and a pick that could be used, because even a pick, and even as much as you like the player, whether it is Obi Melifonwu or Kevin King, is still going to be, a little bit of a crapshoot, a little bit of a 50-50 prospect. So, to give up a player of Sherman's caliber, who is probably going to the Hall of Fame and could have another 6 to 7 good years left in him, is quite the thing to sacrifice for just a draft pick, even if it's a first rounder, even if it's a decent first rounder, because everyone's taking that chance with every player in the draft, including Myles Garrett. It might be, the lowest risk of any prospect in the draft for a guy like Myles Garrett, but we've still seen guys like, Aaron Curry, and we've seen the places where it can just go wrong when it wasn't expected. So they would want to get a guy back that is capable of playing. But as far as the prospects in this draft, you've talked about how John Schneider doesn't sound too keen on this class. Can you sort of just expand on that, and what things he's said that would lead you to believe that maybe this isn't a draft that John Schneider necessarily views as one where he is going to have a great chance? Like, how has he described the draft, and how do you think that'll affect the movements from now until then?
Well, the quote came from when he spoke to ESPN 710 last week. And this is essentially what he said. He said, I don't like the class as much as last year. I think there's different parts of it I do like, and that we want to pick in that range. But he said that there's not quite as much depth all the way through, and that he felt like there's a lot of gaps in the draft this year, parts of the draft where, they don't really see the value. He made reference to the fact that the Seahawks are quite lucky, actually, that they didn't have a 4th and a 5th round pick this year, which suggests that. And look, we've talked about how exciting this draft class is and how good it looks in certain positions. But the more you kind of like peel the layers from it, you can kind of see why John Schneider feels this way. For starters, I think that there's not a great sort of top 10 or 15. There are going to be guys going in the top 10 who are probably graded very similar to the guy going at 20, for example. So you don't have a really defined top 10. Not that that's going to interest the Seahawks, because they're not picking anywhere near the top 10. Then what you have, though, is from about 8 to 10 all the way through to the end of the first round, very similar grades. And then when you go into the top of the second round, it probably goes on to about pick 40, 45, where the grades are similar. And then you start to see a gradual drop off. And then I think by the end of round 2, there's quite a steep drop. And then by the end of round 3, an even steeper drop. And what I kind of thought that Schneider was inferring here is there's a bit of a fear maybe that even though the Seahawks have 3 third-round picks, because they're all at the back end of round 3, that maybe he feels at least 2 of those picks, maybe all 3, have come in a range where there's a big drop-off of talent. So essentially those 3 third-round picks are not worth having, and having the 4th and 5th round pick on top of that, and not being too concerned by that, suggests they're not that bothered about trading back either. So what I kind of think it maybe puts us all together here is that maybe they're going to be quite aggressive. Maybe if they don't see the value with the 3rd round, they're going to use those 3rd round picks to move up and get into a range where they do want to pick, because he does specifically say there are part draft where they do want to pick. And I think that top 45 is probably where they do want to pick. So it wouldn't be a big surprise to me if, they picked at some, whether it's 26 or if they make a small move down and pick in the 30s or whatever, or the later 20s, but make a pick in that range and then move up from 58 using 1 or 2 of their 3rd round picks to maybe get back into the top 45. and get another player. And if they can pick twice in the top 45, then maybe they'll feel pretty good about this. Although also will say, to sort of add on to this, that I think that what they want to do more than anything in any draft class is to pick, a good 6 or 7 players that they feel can genuinely compete rather than just 2. And if they start trading those picks to move up, and because they don't maybe see the depth and the quality in in day 3, maybe they just think that this is a draft class where you've got to try and find 2 impact players early on because everything else is crap. You're just not going to get the impact. You're not going to get a load of depth and competition for this draft class, which makes a lot of sense. So I think that reading into what he was saying there, I think there is perhaps a greater likelihood this year that they will be more aggressive than they have been in the past.
And as far as the Seahawks, what they will do at 26, if they're not, moving up or down, or maybe that's what they will do, is move that pick in one direction. Knowing what you know about the classes at cornerback and safety and pass rusher and offensive line, what positions would you say the Seahawks are going to be most likely to address with their first round pick? Also knowing that they do have 3 picks in the third round and they do have their second round pick, and knowing okay, well, I think that this position's still going to be pretty strong by the second round, and you're still going to get good stuff maybe in the third round with this position. For example, if they're there at 26 and a guy like Forrest Lamp is available, along with the guys that we've talked about like Kevin King and Adoree Jackson and Obi Melifonwu, where does that sort of move your needle? Does that change anything? Like how does the position stack up for that first rounder?
Well, I've talked a lot about recently, and I did another piece about this today, which is about this nickel position. And I actually think it's really interesting. It's kind of a position that I've focused a lot on recently. And it really comes out of the fact that last year the Seahawks did run a lot of a 4-2-5 formation, 2 linebackers, Wagner and Wright, and then 5 DBs. And Jeremy Lane played, 71% of the snaps on defense. And that suggests that maybe the Seahawks are moving away a little bit from the 4-3 under scheme, which has been so prominent during the Super Bowl runs and stuff like that. The Sam linebacker is playing less, and this extra defensive back is actually on the field. And the more I've studied this and the more I've looked into this, I just think increasingly this could be the key to what the Seahawks do early. The 4-2-5 formation fits perfectly to what the Seahawks want to do, funnily enough. If people go on the Seahawks draft blog, they will see the piece there and some quotes from Gary Patterson, who is the TCU head coach. And he sort of breaks down the defense and what it is and stuff like that. And essentially it is a cover 3, which is what the Seahawks run, with a post safety or a middle of the field safety, which is what the Seahawks have, single high safety. It puts the nickel and the strong safety at the line of scrimmage, which is what the Seahawks do already. You can switch the nickel to put it next to the free safety and play a 2 deep look, play cover 2. That again is something the Seahawks are happy to do. The whole focus on it is to provide a simple scheme that promotes execution and athleticism. It's about taking away the run game, establishing an 8-man front, being able to throw a counter punch to teams when they try and manipulate your bend but don't break. Again, very Seahawky, and it preaches about creating takeaways and eliminating big plays. The whole scheme is set up essentially to do what the Seahawks are doing already with their 4-3 under and their cover 3. So it's a system that fits intrinsically what the Seahawks are looking to do. Carroll was very lukewarm about Jeremy Lane's play in the nickel. He's already suggested that he's going to move back outside to cover for Deshaun Shedd, he was the next man up, is the term that Carroll used. And that creates that spot at the nickel. Now, Carroll did say at the owners' meeting to John Clayton that Bradley McDougald could play there, that is an option for them, that they could use him as the big nickel or the buffalo. And that's entirely possible. But when I look at the signing of McDougald, it's a $1.8 million signing. In the second or third wave of free agency, they met with him. He went away. He came back. He said he wanted to sign with Seattle. So they did the deal. I think if they were absolutely desperate to get Bradley McDougald in as the starting nickel in their defense, I think they probably would have made more of an attempt to get him signed up pretty quickly and maybe offered him a little bit more money than the $1.8 million that he got. So the way I see it, I think he's probably a hedge. I think they want to play this system. I think they didn't want to go into the draft and risk missing out on a player they really like to play this nickel. So they brought in McDougald. So whatever happens, they can play the scheme that they want to play. But I think he's a hedge. And I think if they'd be more than happy to have him as safety depth and cover because Cam Chancellor's missed games and Earl Thomas has missed games, I think they quite happily have him as cover and then have a new big nickel type player playing in the 4-2-5. And that's what this draft class is set up for, Kenny. It's really strong at safety and it's really strong at cornerback. And if you can get I think if Obi Melifonwu, because he is essentially the ideal big nickel, he is going to set a new standard for that position. And so many teams are looking for that type of player. He's everything. If you were going to sort of build a human being to play that position, that big nickel role, it would be Obi Melifonwu. He has everything. He's going to set a new standard for that position. So I think if he's there at 26, I think the Seahawks take him, and I think they feel very good about that. There is at least a chance that he's not there. And if he isn't, they will have to look elsewhere. And then it comes to, how much do you want to consider somebody like, for example, Chidobe Awuzie at Colorado, who's got very similar size to Bradley McDougald, who could also play that kind of big nickel role. Is Budda Baker an option? A bit smaller, but still that type of player. Adoree Jackson can play that type of role. Again, he's like Budda Baker, not got the size, but he's got a sensational sudden athleticism, big playmaker, the kind of player that Pete Carroll loves. There's other guys, Justin Evans could do that. And even Kevin King, could play in that type of role instead of playing outside corner. So that is kind of the position that I think I'm going to focus on here. Now, it's not absolutely dyed in the wall. If a lot of the guys they like on there, they could look at outside corner. I don't think the options are going to be that great there. Because of the rush, I think there's going to be kind of a rush on cornerbacks and it's going to weaken the options there. And the other option is maybe pass rusher. And maybe they look at Tyus Bowser or TJ Watt. Maybe one of the top offensive linemen does fall and they consider that thing. But I think more than anything right now, I'm looking at that nickel position on defense. And I think there's at least a chance that could be where they go in round one.
And I think it's interesting too. We talked about Obi Melifonwu, posted this on Field Goals yesterday, which is the draft targets or the draft prospects that the Seahawks have been known to meet with so far. And you can get 30 visits for a team, local visits not counting, and like meetings and all that kind of stuff or whatever. So, and I mean, in the past, the known ones that have been posted on Field Goals, if you go to like 2015, and there was a list of 26 players, and 8 of those players have been Seahawks so far. If you go to last year, there were 4 players that they were known to met with that they drafted or signed after the draft. In 2014, similar numbers where it's going to be a high percentage, relatively speaking, that they're meeting with these guys for a reason. Some of the stuff they're going to keep under wraps and try and make sure that there is no known interest in this guy at all. But Obi Melifonwu is not that. Melifonwu is known to have met with them twice, including, a private meeting and at the combine. Rob, you've posted video or shared video as well of, the looks on Pete and John's faces when Obi Melifonwu was working out. And there's only one other player that they've known to meet with twice, which is free safety David Jones out of Richmond. Not a well-known prospect. Jones is 6'1", 205 pounds, but he ran a 4.43. He had a 10.9 broad jump, a 1.50 in the 10-yard dash, and some really impressive numbers, 34-inch vertical jump. So, and he also, I think, returns kicks and is being projected by NFL Draft Scout as a 7th round to free agency. So maybe a later guy to prospect to look at there, depending on, I don't know where his stock's at this point. But that's one guy that they've met with twice, him and Melifonwu. So safety seems to definitely be up there. And the rest of the list, if you're going offensive linemen, they've only been known to meet with 2, Isaac Asiata and Zach Banner. Asiata, of course, the guard out of Utah, who is, has been showing up on, Rob, your list because of his athletic profile. And he's just below, when I saw just below the TEF score of 3.0 at 2.96. So certainly at the athletic profile, to get there. They've also met with tight end Anthony Auclair out of Canada, safety Budda Baker, well-known at University of Washington, defensive end Jonathan Calvin, cornerback Xavier Coleman, running back Dalton Crossan, cornerback Shaquille Griffin, Outside linebacker Javancy Jones, safety Shalom Luani out of Washington State. Again, another player, Rob, that you like a lot, that you've talked about a lot. Outside linebacker Carroll Phillips, defensive tackle Grover Stewart, cornerback Cordrea Tankersley, defensive tackle Dalvin Tomlinson. Both those players have been talked about in the second round for Seattle. Defensive tackle Josh Dupeau. Wide receiver Chad Williams, linebacker Tim Williams out of Alabama, cornerback Brandon Wilson, and wide receiver D'Angelo Yancey. So out of those 21 names, besides Melifonwu, Rob, does anything stand out to you as, yeah, I see that they've been meeting with this guy, and the more I looked at him, the more I think this guy is definitely destined to be on the Seahawks?
Well, a lot of Seattle's meetings in the past have been indicative of players they want to draft or, would consider. And a lot of them are athletes. So a lot of them are players that meet physical ideals. So George Fant was a great example a year ago. Some of the defensive talent they brought in as undrafted free agents were essentially guys who were, they tick certain boxes in terms of what they look for physically, and they bring them in and they have a closer look. And a lot of these guys end up getting either drafted in the later rounds or they're undrafted guys. And, of that list, any of them could be drafted. I mean, like, any of them could be signed. Any of them could land in Seattle. They very rarely, there seems to be a degree of transparency about what they do with these meetings. So they will bring guys in, they will work them out. They will see how they fit around the building. They will see if they've got the right kind of character. They may be smaller school guys that they don't have as much intel on as other guys. They want to learn about them. So, I mean, from that list, the name that stands out to me, Kenny, and it's kind of stood out for a long time, is Shalom Luani, who I think they worked out at his pro day. I'm not sure whether I know they have kind of these local, you're allowed to meet with so many local prospects.
I don't think that Washington State counts. I mean, that's what my understanding. I don't think the Cougars count, but I could be totally wrong.
I didn't know. I was just sort of, I kind of like pondering whether or not he is or not. But as far as I'm aware, they were at his pro day and did quite a close workout with him. And if they don't take one of these big nickel types early, then I could definitely see Shalom Luani actually going surprisingly high. Not a lot of people in the national media talk about him. He's kind of like he's an afterthought, really. I mean, like, you very rarely see him mentioned. I know that his NFL.com profile didn't pop up until, I think, even after the combine. He doesn't get talked about. Most people consider him to be an undrafted free agent type of player, but I could imagine him going a bit earlier than people think, because he's athletic. He had a great short area quickness is good, hits like a sledgehammer, has been productive, has had big plays in his career, has this incredible backstory, which is incredibly Seahawky. So, I can imagine them really tuning into him. And if they don't take, like say, this nickel position, if they don't add to that in the first round, if they go in a different direction, whether that's O-line, whether that's outside cornerback, whether that's pass rusher, well, whatever it is, then I could definitely see him being a consideration as early as maybe even round 3. I mean, he could fit that mold. I could even see them taking him just to provide some depth at safety as well, because this is the thing, we can look at these safeties and with how many do they need? Well, they need some right now, because Bradley McDougald is the only backup safety, I think, on the roster behind Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor. And if you're intending on him to start in the nickel position, then he's not even really a backup safety. So you need some depth there. You need some players who can come in and play. So I think that Shalom Luani it's highly likely, I think, that there's a chance the Seahawks will be looking at him, if not other teams, and that he will go surprisingly high compared to where the national narrative has got him going.
I mean, I'm all for that. As a Cougs alumni, I would definitely welcome some stuff going on there. And I think this entire list, they're definitely going to look at it and come away in a couple, in maybe a month. You'll see a few names that are now Seahawks, and in a couple of years, maybe a few more. They may not all, be big names. Some of the guys that they've had in the past in for visits that later became Seahawks were not Seahawks for long, and they would not be remembered by people who are Seahawks fans, and that's not a bad thing. They're just on that 90-man roster sometimes, and they go, or they're on the practice squad. It's not like a bunch of people are out there talking about Dalton Crossan or, Grover Stewart, which doesn't mean that they're bad players. The Seahawks just want to get a closer look. I mean, just today, the Seahawks signed wide receiver in quotes, Cyril Grayson, who was an LSU track star who ran a 4.33 at LSU's pro day, even though he hasn't played football since 2011 in high school, where he apparently averaged 26 yards per catch, but went on to become a 7-time All-American track star for the Tigers, and 23 years old, is now sort of a project for the Seahawks. He's 5'9", 178 pounds, so he's filling in, sort of that very small but fast role and can compete. I can't imagine, Rob, that you I'm just dropping in some news here, but I can't imagine that you know anything about Cyril Grayson as we're all finding out right now, or if there's anything you want to say about the move, I welcome you to say so.
I can safely say I know absolutely nothing about him.
There you go. Nobody does, but I'm sure that he will be a fan favorite that's people are rooting for, and he'll make one catch, and people's minds will begin to wander as they are wont to do. Overall, back to the draft. You talk about Kevin King, you talk about Obi Melifonwu, but there's this other guy from Colorado, Akella Witherspoon, who, for all intents and purposes, is maybe a hair behind Kevin King in terms of athletically gifted, and from what I understand, had really good numbers when thrown at Colorado, so he was getting the job done. We talk about those guys in the first round, but Akella Witherspoon more like the second or third round. Why is that? And is that something you expect to continue up to the draft?
Well, he's a very interesting player, Kenny, because if people have looked at the stats, passes defended, there was only one more player in the whole country in any conference that had more passes defended than Witherspoon in 2016, and that was his teammate Tedrick Thompson, who's the safety at Colorado. So incredibly productive in that regard. When you actually throw on the tape and watch him, he is really, really good in coverage. A really good cover corner. Against really good players as well. I mean, I've said this a few times, I think on the podcast and on the blog, that I've not seen anybody cover John Ross as well as he did. John Ross isn't just, I know that the headline is he's a 4.22 runner or whatever. People think he just runs in a straight line and that's all he is. No, John Ross is incredible at getting open very quickly in his. And he managed that because he has tremendous short area quickness himself, and get a 4.13 short shuttle, which is really good. And he's really quick, running the fourth. I think he did a 4.43 40. So he was sticking to this guy. He's got these really long levers, great length and size, and manages to get a hand on the ball consistently. Not seen him beaten very often in coverage, and there was an incredible amount to like there. You also find out about his background. I think he is pre-med. I think he intends to become a doctor when he's finished playing in the NFL. So he's obviously a really smart guy. So there's a lot to like. But then there comes the but, okay? Because this is the problem with, and it is a big problem with Akella Witherspoon. And it's another thing I've written about today, is that I watched 3 of his games yesterday. And I knew this was a problem. I'd highlighted this as a problem in the past. But it kind of reinforced how much of a problem it is. He has no aspect of run defense whatsoever. It's not that he has bad tackling technique, that he had a lot of broken tackles, that it's something that you spend the whole offseason working with him on. He shows zero willingness to do anything in the run game. There were literally plays on the tape where it looked like he was running away from the ball carrier, that he just didn't want anything to do with the tackle. To put this into perspective, a cornerback doesn't have to make loads and loads of great tackles, but when the play bounces to their side, whether it's a running back who's running the ball, or whether it's a wide receiver screen or an end around or whatever, more often than not, all they have to do is hold their position. So even if there's a receiver blocking them or whatever, as long as they hold their position and don't get shoved out of the play, their mere presence on that side of the field will force the running back inside. And that's what teams always want to do. They want to force the ball carrier back inside to where the crowd of bodies are. It's very easy for someone to make a tackle. Witherspoon never seemed to grasp this. So often he would bring himself inside, almost as if he was avoiding the play and leaving these huge lanes down the outside. Now, at the next level, he's not going to get away with this. And the times when he's not just driven off the ball, he's going to leave you. You are just going to see teams saying, run to his side, stretch plays out. We'll toss the pitch to the running back. We'll get him bouncing outside. We'll throw wide receiver screens his side all day. We will throw bubble screens his side all day until he gets a grasp of how to just handle his side of the field. When the guy's got the ball in hand on his side, he's going to be a liability consistently. And this is a major, major issue for him. And the only way that I think you can determine whether or not he's going to be able to get over this at the next level is by sitting down in a room with him and just sort of listing all of these complaints in front of him and seeing how he responds, and sort of looking him in the eye and saying, are you going to do a better job? Do you want to tackle people? Are you willing to just hold a block on your, to be blocked, but just to hold your position or stay on your side to enable the running play to cut back inside to a linebacker or a safety can hit this guy? And until you sort of get that feeling from being with him and asking him that and feeling whether he's got that in him, then it's really hard to justify even taking him in the second or the third round, because you can be great in coverage all day. If you cannot even do a 5% job in terms of contain and defending the run on your side, especially in a team that is so determined to stop the run like the Seahawks are, like most teams are, to take away the running game, it just isn't going to work. And it's a real shame, Kenny, because I actually did another piece this week. I know that we focus a lot on arm length and saying that, there's Seahawks have never drafted anybody with shorter arms than 32 inches. Well, if you actually break it down, I'm not sure that they don't put as much attention onto wingspan. Wingspan is maybe even more important. That's a greater judgment of length. They've never drafted anybody with a wingspan that is less than 77 inches. And when you actually run through the draft class, there's a lot of guys with 32-inch arms, but in terms of cornerbacks, I can run through the list. It's really short that have got a 77-inch wingspan. Kevin King, Witherspoon, Marquez White, Treston Deku, Brian Allen, and Michael Davis. That is it. There are 6 cornerbacks. And if you're going to strike Witherspoon off the list because he can't defend the run, then you're lowering that list even more.
Yeah, about that list, I'm also kind of curious your thoughts, because when we talk about 32-inch arms in the past, we talk about guys that the Seahawks would target, but, you've also expanded beyond that to say you won't find very many cornerbacks on any team that are successful with less than 32-inch arms. And it's sort of played out that a lot of the guys that, as cornerbacks were considered busts had like short arms, and a lot of the guys that were, maybe day 3 or undrafted free agents that turned out to be pretty good had plus 32-inch arms. And it was something that seemed to follow along those lines. And if we're adding into wingspan to 77-inch wingspan, I mean, if you look at the guys that are expected to go early, Marshawn Lattimore has 31.25-inch arms and a 74, just under 75-inch wingspan. Marlon Humphrey has got the, he's got the length. It's just barely under maybe the wingspan. Tre'Davious White has over 32-inch arms. But then, even a guy like Sidney Jones has 31.5-inch arms and a very minuscule 71 and 7/8-inch wingspan. I mean, in your opinion, when you look at someone like Sidney Jones, who has short arms and a tiny wingspan, do you think that is a red flag that every team should look into, besides just the torn Achilles? But if we're looking at Sidney Jones or Marshawn Lattimore, do you think that they could be that there's a red flag there because of their length?
Yes, absolutely. There should be. And when you to be fair, this makes a lot of sense. When you watch Sidney Jones, when people were asking about Sidney Jones on the blog during the season, they would say, what do you think about Sidney Jones? And I'd say, well, technically fantastic. Seems to completely understand the cornerback position when he is challenged, which is very rare to make plays. He does it. But the guy just looks dinky. I mean, he looks tiny. And then I would go on to his profile expecting to see like a 5'9" cornerback, something like this. And then he'd be listed, I can't remember what he's listed, but, about 6 foot and, reasonable size. And you'd think, well, that's surprising. Why does he look so small? And the reason is clearly because he does not have a big body. He might have 31.5-inch arms. I generally think that, most people have an arm like, you don't get many people with like 26-inch arms. Generally arm length is pretty consistent amongst human beings, and he's got average NFL arm length, but he has way below the average. The average wingspan, I think, is about 75, 76 inches for an NFL cornerback, and he's at like 72. So, and that makes sense. Okay, he's really small. That proves that he's really, the eyes were not deceiving us. He is really small. And when you look at some of these other guys, yeah, it does make a difference because, Marlon Humphrey is not 6'3". He's 6 foot and 197 pounds. And now you're saying, well, actually, the wingspan's not that great. He's not a big cornerback. He's an average size cornerback. That's what he is. And you run through the others. Tre'Davious White is an average size cornerback. Garion Conley is an average size. He has great arm length, 33-inch arms, 76-inch wingspan. It's less than Marlon Humphrey. These guys are average size cornerbacks. They are not incredibly long Seahawks cornerbacks. The Seahawks have looked for 77 and a half inch wingspan as an absolute minimum for the players they've drafted, the data that we've got. And it's just one of those things that if you're going to have a wingspan that long, the chances are you're also going to have 32-inch arms. So while we focus a lot on 32-inch arms, wingspan might be the most important thing to focus on. And when you look, when we were talking earlier about John Schneider not incredibly excited about this draft class, what have you heard for the last few months? Cornerback is really deep. It's a really deep class of cornerback. But then when you look at the cornerbacks that are there, and you say, okay, well, this guy's not got the length, this guy's not got that, and you actually sort of peel it down. If they are looking specifically for long cornerbacks, it is not a great draft class. People keep harping on about the running back class. I think it's one of the most overrated running back classes we will ever see. There's a lot of average running backs out there, and there's some really good big name running backs at the top, and then there's a lot of average. The Seahawks go and sign Eddie Lacy because that for me was a review of the running back class, so we can kind of notch that one down again. I don't. It's very deep at tight end, but at what point do you take one? You're not going to get Evan Engram at 58. So, at what point do you take one? And these are the kind of things that become. I can imagine frustrating a GM who's really clued up, who really understands this class, who's put in a lot of work, who kind of has the people working behind the scenes who can provide this data for them. I can see all of a sudden why you might get a little bit frustrated with it. And listen. Could be completely wrong. Maybe the Seahawks will take one of these guys with a 76-inch wingspan or something, but the evidence has not shown that so far. I'll repeat it again. They have not drafted a cornerback based on the data that is available on the internet. They have not drafted a cornerback with a wingspan less than 77 inches. And there is only Kevin King and Keller Witherspoon amongst the top cornerbacks in this draft who've got that. They may well look at Marquez White or Treston Deku on day 3. That's a possibility, but they're not the big names. And if to compound the issue, Kenny, and just to finish with this, to compound the issue, if people want to know, well, is it strange that the cornerback class has only got 6 guys with the requisite wingspan? Is that a strange thing? Is it common? It is not common. And it is not common because all you have to do is look at the safety class. There are 13 safeties in this draft, more than twice as many cornerbacks with the 77-inch wingspan. Malik Hooker has got 78-inch wingspan. Marcus May, 77. Melifonwu, 79. You run through the list. The safeties are longer than the cornerbacks in this draft class.
Let me ask you
another reason why they might go safety early instead of cornerback. There you have it. The length, the difference in length.
I want to ask you about one of the guys on that list that you sort of trailed off before you mentioning him, and that's Brian Allen, the cornerback out of Utah. And I'm looking more into him, and another guy that he was converted from wide receiver to cornerback by Colorado, which of course makes me think of Richard Sherman being converted from wide receiver to cornerback by Stanford. And then if you compare Richard Sherman as a draft prospect to Brian Allen as a draft prospect, Richard Sherman was 6'3", 195 pounds with 32-inch arms and 9 3/4 hands. Brian Allen is 6'3", he's 215 pounds, he's got 34-inch arms and 10-inch hands. So he's the same height. He's a little bigger, but he's got longer arms and bigger hands. And despite being bigger, Richard Sherman ran a 4.56. Brian Allen ran a 4.48. They both pretty much did the same thing on the bench. Richard Sherman jumped up 38 inches. Brian Allen jumped up 34.5 inches. Richard Sherman's broad jump is 8 inches longer than Allen's, which is certainly impressive. But Allen has got a much faster time in the 3-cone drill, going 6.64, whereas Sherman did 6.82. And if you look, even if you look back at Sherman's weaknesses as seen on tape, that he was not. It wasn't just he's in. He's. I think in the case of Akella Witherspoon, in coverage, he looks great. And for Sherman, the weaknesses listed on NFL's page can be baited out of position when in zone and a tick late to diagnose underneath routes. Tall, high-cut prospect who displays some hip stiffness, not explosive when transitioning or when changing direction, lacks great recovery skills when beaten off the line, can struggle tackling in the open field. And with Brian Allen, said he didn't. It says foreign wide receiver said he didn't know how to tackle when he made the switch and still has issues with it. Ducks head into contact and rarely squares up. His target finishing rate as a tackler was below desired rate. Ball skills aren't where they need to be. Slow to find the deep throw and make adjustments to the ball path. Allowed 21 yards per catch in 2016. Could struggle badly against bombs away. Offensive approach. Hips and feet are clunky when forced to open suddenly and off coverage, and he loses balances too often in transitions forward. So like with Brian Allen having the size and length he does, and not being a top prospect and perhaps being available later on in the draft, and sort of thinking about whether or not the Seahawks can teach him the kick step technique and mold him into being to do the things that Richard Sherman supposedly couldn't do when coming into the draft. Did you have any thoughts on Brian Allen and whether or not he would be, available as a day 3 or undrafted free agent prospect?
Well, look, it comes down. I mean, it's very difficult to offer an opinion on Brian Allen because the access to what he's done is not on the internet, really. The only way to do it would be to go onto RT Sports uploads and go back and watch games and see if there was any footage in particular of him, which would be tough to follow. So I can't really offer much of an opinion on what he is, based on the limited resources that we have available online. But what I will say is that there's an assumption. I think that people have assumed that that this is about outside cornerback for the Seahawks. That Deshaun Shedd has got injured. That they're going to find a replacement for him, and that's going to be the key ultimately. And I don't think that way whatsoever. I think it's possible. I think that if Kevin King was there, then it's entirely possible they would draft him, play him outside. I think that because Kevin King is so exceptional in terms of his athletic profile, I think it's increasingly unlikely that he will be there at 26. But if he is, he's definitely an option. But that aside, I think it would take a truly exceptional cornerback for this, and they would have to have the length, and they'd have to have the athleticism, and they'd have to have the speed, and they'd have to have everything for the Seahawks to take him at 26 to be an outside cornerback, given the success they've had with late round outside cornerbacks. And I don't think, Kevin King aside, that player exists. Witherspoon could have been it, but tackling not good enough. So I think what they're going to do is the focus is going to be, you put Jeremy Lane at outside cornerback. They probably don't trade Richard Sherman. So they put Lane outside. They let him compete with Pierre Desir. They let him compete with Nico Thorpe. They let him compete with whoever else I'm forgetting who's also on the roster who can compete there. And then what they do is they draft a nickel. And that's what I think it's going to be. And then I think you're right. I think Brian Allen or Marquez White or Treston Deku or people like that are going to be players they consider on day 3, and they do what they've always done, which is bring these long outside cornerbacks in who fit their profile, who do what they need to do, and they train them up and they put them in the kick slide or whatever it's called. And then that is what the Seahawks have done for 7 years. That is the evidence that we have. This idea that they're suddenly going to start drafting loads of outside cornerbacks and starting them straight away is completely foreign to what they have done so far. Doesn't mean that it's impossible, that it won't happen for sure, but I think that that's the kind of mentality we have to have with this. Pete Carroll has already said that he intends Jeremy Lane to go outside and be the next man up for Deshaun Shedd at nickel for a competition there. And I think that is going to be their priority. And I think it's going to be very difficult for rookies to learn the technique in time to start anyway. I think they're going to want an impact player. You don't play kick slide and cut a nickel cornerback or big nickel. You play a completely different skill set. So that's the learning curve is probably not quite as high as it is at outside cornerback, where they are very specific. So I think that's what essentially is going to happen. And I could imagine them easily taking someone like Brian Allen on day 3 for the exact reasons I've just talked about there.
Yeah, and just quickly on the safeties, because you mentioned the 77-inch wingspan, and when you look at the few safeties really that didn't hit that mark, we're talking about Jamal Adams, who was being projected as a top 5 pick by some because of his speed. Buda Baker, of course, would be well known to Seahawks fans and his and Huskies fans, and his wingspan is about as short as teammate Sidney Jones is. Jabril Peppers, who a lot of people talk about because he was, a Heisman candidate last year for Michigan, and way down at the bottom there, Shalom Luwani, who has 32-inch arms and a 74.5-inch wingspan. Do you have concerns for those players because of their size?
So the names again, Kenny.
Yeah, that's Jamal Adams, Buda Baker, Jabril Peppers, and Shalom Luwani.
I don't, because because they'll be working inside, and the difference is that when you're out, I'm not employed by the Seahawks. I don't know why they value length so much, other than the obvious reasons. But Earl Thomas's wingspan is, off memory, it's not particularly good. I have got it written down somewhere. If you just bear with me, I will find it out for you. So okay. So it's 74.5, which is below average for cornerbacks in the NFL. And Cam Chancellor, Cam Chancellor's a big guy. His wingspan is 76.5. So even that's below, what they've chosen for the cornerbacks. So obviously playing inside, the need for length is not quite as important, and I think it's pretty obvious. You're sort of playing in space a lot more. It's about short area quickness. It's about being able to run to the ball and read and react and stuff like that. So it's not about I think if I was to guess, without any research whatsoever, what the importance of length is at cornerback, it's to try and keep just to avoid being jammed at the line. I guess it's to sort of be able to offer that sort of initial jab and reroute receivers off the snap, to be able to sort of get them out of their stride, get them out of their comfort zone. It's much easier to do that if you're longer. I think then it's about, being able to reroute them, and then without the need for exceptional athleticism, having the length to then get a paw in there and try and break up the pass. And then if it's over the top, to sort of win the red line, sort of ease your receiver, the guy you are covering, over towards the sideline, limit the space that he's got for the target, and then have a big catching radius so that you can be the one to shield the ball or even make an interception. That is why I think they value length on the outside. On the inside, none of that really applies. I mean, you could have the longest arms in the world. If you can't cover a guy like Julian Edelman, who's really quicker, running across the middle, if you haven't got sort of that physicality to handle, having to cover a bigger tight end, then length isn't going to help you there, I'm afraid. That it's a completely different skill set. So people like Luwani, people like Buda Baker, they really are doing a completely different job. They're never going to play outside. They're always going to be at nickel or at safety. And that's why I don't think arm length matters as much. That's why Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor don't have the great the wingspan that we've talked about. And I don't think it'll matter as well. Potentially for other guys they draft there. But if they draft Obi Melifonwu there, then he's got nearly, 79, 80-inch wingspan. So it'll be another positive for him if they draft him for that spot.
And are there any players that are being mocked to the Seahawks a lot, or some guys that you've seen maybe once by a reputable source, or guys that you've seen mocked there at 26, just players that, knowing what you know about John Schneider, Pete Carroll, and their drafting history, are that fans should just ignore that and scratch that off their list, that they're not going to take so-and-so who's been mocked to them several times. They're not going to take this other guy that, you've seen before by Mel Kiper or whatever, whether it's because they don't fit the athletic profile or because they've got, concerns otherwise, and I don't know if this is right or wrong, but like for example, Ryan Ramczyk, is a guy that you see go to the Seahawks quite a bit. Cam Robinson, someone like that. I'm just throwing out names, but are there names that you have on your list that you would say to Seahawks fans, don't expect them to take so and so, even though I know it's been said?
Well, I guess two thoughts here. First of all, I think nearly all of the mock drafts that I read these days have the Seahawks drafting Garrett Bowles, who, I love Garrett Bowles. I don't think there's any way whatsoever he's going to be there at 26. I think that his absolute lowest point he goes in the draft is at 20. But a lot of them seem to put Bowles at 26. I don't think people realize how early he's going to go. And the other pick is Kevin King, who I totally understand why they go with that, and I think it's entirely possible. And I think if Bowles or King were there, and I haven't really seen anything other than those two for a long time. I mean, occasionally it's Robinson, and occasionally it's Ramczyk, and it's hard to sort of say, well, they definitely won't do that because offensive line is still a need, I think. And I think if one of the top offensive linemen did fall to 26, they would have to consider it. So I can't say there's been any mock drafts where I've kind of scoffed and thought, no, that's not going to happen. I mean, apart from the fact that I don't think that Bowles, Ramczyk, and Robinson are going to be there, and Kevin King might not be there, I've not really scoffed at anything. What I will say, though, Kenny, the second point I want to make is, oh my God, there are too many mock drafts these days. There really are. I feel like if I see another mock draft, even I'm going to bang my head against the wall. And I know the irony there. As someone who has written an awful lot of mock drafts over the last 6 months about this draft class, but it just seems like everybody does a mock draft now. And like 10 years ago when I started writing the blog, you would probably get about 5 or 6 people who do reasonably regular mock drafts, and they would maybe do one every couple of weeks. And it was, a few specialist blogs and people like Rob Rang and one or two others. And now it's like you have people on Twitter who are basically Twitter analysts who do mock drafts. You get people on all of the major networks doing mock drafts. You get beat writers who are doing mock drafts. You get like every man and his dog has done a mock draft, and eventually they all just blend into one big mulch of mock drafts. There is very little difference between any of them of any note. And like I haven't written it. I mean, I did when we did the 7-round mock draft on field goals recently, I did like I just wanted to put like a first round down so that people could understand, kind of why I'd done what I did, because I thought if I don't do this, then people are going to say, why have you got like Adoree Jackson at 26? Wouldn't they take this guy instead? And then I'd have to sort of in the comment section go, but in this projection, they were gone. So I thought better just to sort of put a first round in there to 25, and now here's the picks for Seattle. That I think is the last mock draft I've done in the last month, because I personally just cannot take any more mock drafts. They're just the NFL.com has got about 5 people doing mock drafts for them when they could just ask Daniel Jeremiah to do them, or they have everybody doing a mock draft. You have Mel Kiper brings out a mock draft, and then 2 days later, he and Todd McShay bring out a 2-round mock draft that they've done at the same time. And it's like, well, didn't Mel Kiper just do a mock draft? And now he's doing another one like 2 days later, and he's on ESPN all the time talking about it. You've got like 6 people on CBS doing mock drafts. You've got like Bleacher Report has like 100 million people doing mock drafts. You've got like everybody is doing mock drafts, and like it's kind of killed the mock draft for me. I just think that it's made it such a pointless exercise because everybody's mocks are the same. And guess what? I'm gonna probably do one soon. And my mock draft will be just as crappy as everybody else's. And one final point on this rant, because that's what it is. I'm so tired of seeing sort of national types posting a mock draft on Twitter and then making jokey remarks like, you'll no doubt think that this is the worst mock draft in the world, or like they'll tweet someone saying this is the worst mock draft. It's like this. It's not funny. Yeah, people send daft comments in response to mock drafts. People send daft comments on Twitter about any subject. We don't need to see, you get some grief sometimes when you do a mock draft. It's the internet. It happens.
Well, it took 10 years, but I think the mock drafts have finally circled back and finally eaten you to your core, Rob. And there's only so many mock drafts a person can do in their life or see in their life before I think we all lose our minds.
I bet Skip Bayless will do a mock draft next week, and he'll do something ridiculous like put Tim Tebow at number 2 or something like that, and like we will finally know that the shark has well and truly been jumped at that point.
I mean, I've been asked to do mock drafts by outlets within the last month, and it's they're so, and the reasoning being they do so well because people just they read them, and it's just one of those things like for me, like mock drafts, I don't I think what I hate about mock drafts in general is not the mock draft themselves, but the way that they are treated. Because, and I don't mean in the way of like people talking shit about them. I'm saying people don't understand them. People, like a lot of people, they don't understand that the mock draft is not, it's not so much for me predictive, and it's not so much for me something where it's like I'm reading this because I want to know who the Saints are going to pick at 11. Now I want to know who the Broncos are going to pick at 20, and I want to know who the Saints are going to pick again at 32. That's not what I'm there for. What I'm there for is who's good. Like that's pretty much my thing, is like who's being viewed as good. And even then, mock drafts miss the point. A lot of them, from the author's perspective, I think, in terms of you mock, like there's because they all look the same, Rob, and you say it starts somewhere. For the most part, it probably starts with Mel Kiper, but even Mel Kiper, eventually has to eat his own tail, which is everybody sees something on a mock and they go, well, no, I know for sure that and I'm just trying to pull up any name here, but I know for sure that Malik Hooker is a top 5 pick. So if he goes 15th overall, those teams were stupid. And it's like, no, maybe, but in general, it's like when you say a guy falls in the draft, what they're really saying is, if it's Mel Kiper, is like, I can't believe that Johnny Manziel is still on the board. This is unbelievable. Well, just because you thought that he was a top 5 pick, it doesn't mean that the NFL clearly do not, and it doesn't mean that they're not going to be a good player. It just means that their draft stock was not what you thought it was, because I think that certainly the draft stock changes as the draft goes. It's an organic beast. And, if a team picks a player that was surprising, like say the Seahawks picking Bruce Irvin in 2012, then it's a domino effect. And if you ran the 2017 NFL draft 100 times, you would get 100 different results, and they would be vastly different in many respects, because it just takes that one change. But I think that the mock draft is just misunderstood by too many people, and therefore it creates and it's too many people doing something because they saw it somewhere else. It's not people who have done any research into the organization, the general manager's draft history, the coach's draft history, the needs of the team, how that relationship works, who the scouts are, what goes into their draft thoughts and their draft needs. And like you say, with the way that you should have the best view of the Seahawks as almost anyone out there that's doing mock drafts, if not anybody out there literally doing mock drafts, that you should have the best view of the Seahawks because it's the team that you follow the most. Which means that I think for a lot of people, when I see Kevin King and Garrett Bowles in all of these other mock drafts, I'm saying that started with you, and I'm saying that started with Seahawks Draft Blog becoming a source for all of these people to say, well, what does that guy say the Seahawks like, or what they'll need? And then it becomes, maybe there's now 32 of those guys out there that, and I only know one out of the 32, but maybe there's 32 of those guys out there that are influencing the mock drafts. But it's just that the mock drafts themselves, the only weight they carry, it's like the worst articles that you will read on the internet are the NFL draft grades that come out during the draft or after the draft within, a day, that anything within 3 years, but like those are the worst, but people still read the shit out of them because they want to know how their team did, even though we have no idea how they did. And it's all just based on like, well, they got Akella Witherspoon in the 4th round, and that's a fucking steal. Well, is it? Why did he go there? We don't know that yet, and we'll find out, but if it's a situation where it's like, okay, well, I think that, the Cowboys had the best draft because La'el Collins was undrafted. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe that's a good value. I'm still looking at, and here we are a few years later, and Collins hasn't played very much. And I mean, that's not necessarily something that was predictive, but like, that's the whole thing, is that you want to do the whole draft grades just as based on what really happens. And the same thing with mock drafts. I think for me, it's like I'm out there and I'm like, yeah, okay, I hope that if I do a mock draft, I just hope that it's like, I hope that it gets across the point of what I think that team needs, what I think is a position that would be best filled at that spot, and who is a player that you can consider good. Because then once we get past the whole NFL thing, we also then have to get in, well, do you know college football? Have you watched the tape? I mean, do you know these guys? How much have you seen of these guys? I mean, how many people in the world are there really that can actually say that they have a really excellent knowledge on both the NFL side and the college side at any given time? I don't have very much knowledge on the college side. It's one of the reasons we do this podcast. But I think there's a lot more that goes into it than meets the eye, and that leads to a lot of misinterpreted opinions.
Here's a great example of that. I'm not going to mention any names. I don't think it's fair, but you will see there are national, high-profile, big name draft analysts who put together top 50 big boards, top 25 big boards. And you will also see them tweeting regularly over the last few weeks. I've just got into this guy's tape. I've just watched him. Wow, this guy was better than I thought. And then in their next updated top 50, they will move that guy up. And you think, how have you even compiled the top 50 board? Or why would you put any faith in a top 50 board that contains players that you haven't really watched? Because if you're doing that, you're either going off what somebody else has told you, or you're just putting them in there because that's what the consensus is on the internet already. And this is why I don't do big boards at all on the blog, because I feel like unless I've watched every player for the exact amount of same games, and I can make a fair judgment of 50 people, and probably more than that, because the ones you've left out as well. And unless I can say that I can honestly do that, then I'm not ranking players, because I'm not qualified to do that. If I was trying to sell that article, even though it's a free blog, if I was trying to say, look, read this and respect this opinion, it would be a useless opinion. What I can do is I can comment on players that I've watched. I can put together a mock draft. I can watch a guy and say, this is what he is. This is an argument why I think the Seahawks might draft him. But I just think this whole, there's this thing around mock drafts, and look, we've been talking about, I was talking a bit about big boards there, but the whole mock draft thing, you're right. There are people doing these. I think a mock draft done in November is probably half as accurate as one done in March, but is much more worthwhile, because at least in November or October, someone is saying, these are the players playing well in college football. I watched this game and this guy did this, or I watched this game and this guy did this. And then you can go and watch the college games, and you can keep an eye on that guy. So, we talked about Garrett Bowles quite early in the process. I would imagine that somebody, at least one person somewhere, has heard me and you, Kenny, talking about Garrett Bowles, and then maybe watched the Utah-Washington game, or watched Utah play Washington State, or watched Utah playing whoever, and focused on Garrett Bowles and looked out for that guy, because the mock draft suggested that he could be someone the Seahawks look for. And when we put Hassan Reddick in the first round to the Seahawks in December, and everyone's like, well, I didn't mind him in round 2, but, you're saying he's a round 1 pick now. You can then say, well, look, this guy is somebody who realistically could make a big move up the boards in the coming weeks. And that's what's happened. Hassan Reddick could go in the top 10. So you are looking at possibilities. And then what happens around February and March is the combine happens, and then everybody's got an opinion. Everybody has seen these players do well at the combine. Everybody has heard, the same 5 or 6 draft analysts talking about these players. Everybody feels now that they are qualified to judge, and they're qualified where to rank these players. And then you just get these just swarms of mock drafts that are all the same. And you're right, they are so clickbait, and they are so tempting. I mean, I read probably every single one. I'm sat here and I am the problem, because if someone says I've done a mock draft and it pops up on my Twitter timeline, I will click on it. I guarantee it. I'll click on it. I'll have a look. I'll probably spend 10 seconds looking at it, and we'll click off, and it's a click, and that's what they want, and that's what they're there for. And in that regard, congratulations, that the internet is here for people to click on things and do it. And quality of writing and providing a product that actually matters is less important these days than how many people are watching or clicking or doing whatever it is people do on the internet at your stuff. So that's why mock drafts will be here forever. And I'm just bring on the 27th of April is what I'm going to say.
Yeah, we're just 2 weeks away from the draft, and then we can stop speculating and, start, salivating. How about that? At the idea of some new NFL players, and certainly some that'll be with the Seahawks, which is fun. And so I think that's a good note to end this week's 3000 NFL mock draft on. So then when we come back next week, will Richard Sherman still be a Seahawk? Who knows? Will Marshawn Lynch be somewhere in the NFL? Who knows? We'll see. That's something that we get to find out, but certainly the draft is a fun thing also that gets to happen in a few weeks. I don't know why I host a podcast, because I can barely talk most of the time. So that's it. Rob, any final words? I'm sure you do a better job of talking than I can.
Well, I'd just like to apologise to everybody for my basically complaining for the last 20 minutes about mock drafts. This is usually quite a positive podcast, Kenny. We talk about players that are really cool and, could go to the Seahawks, and we generally talk positively about the Seahawks prospects. And I think this is probably the first time we've spent half a podcast moaning about something, or at least I have. So if people were sat there kind of infuriated at my disdain for the mass, forcing of mock drafts on the world, then I sincerely apologize, and I guarantee that next week we will be back to being really positive and thinking about what the Seahawks are going to do, and hopefully Richard Sherman and the Seahawks have had a cuddle and everything's smoothed over, and we can look forward to what they're going to do on the 27th and the 28th, because they seem to be the two big days in the draft this year.
Yep. And it's not so bad to rant sometimes and get those points of views out there. This is 3000 NFL mock draft. You can follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staten, and go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com. I'm at Kenneth Arthur S, or at Field Goals, and of course go to FieldGoals.com. And if you like the show, share it, tell people, this is our crunch time as we get closer to the actual NFL draft. And that'll be fun. And come and tune in for those episodes, as well as we cover the draft, as it's happening or shortly after it happens. And you can support us on Twitter or, on the websites, and just tell people that it's not so bad. Subscribe on iTunes. Do it with Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur in order to get 3000 NFL mock draft, which is not confusing whatsoever. So that'll do it for this edition of the draft, and come in next week for a brand new draft.